Since I do want to paint the nose cone before I install it into the payload section, I'm first going to have to remove here the nose cone itself from the payload coupler. And so I'm just going to cut this around at the seam here. Going a little bit too far there. Okay, slipped down a little bit here, but that's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. And here I'm going to go ahead and just do a little bit of trimming. And make sure you get your hands where if you slip you don't cut something, especially your hands. Now I'm going to take some fine sandpaper here, and I'm just going to lightly sand around that edge, make it more flush. Okay, it's not perfectly uniform, but that took the edges and sharp spots off. And I'm going to use this to sand the seams here especially, to even those out. And then I'm just going to sand the entire nose cone lightly, and that will help the paint stick better. Now on those seams I'm sanding a little bit more, and the idea here is to knock down any high plastic and then get the plastic around the seam there down to the same level on the low spots. Now you may not get it completely level that way, because in some cases this is down far enough that to sand all the way down would weaken the nose cone. But I'm going to make it less prominent, and then when I go to add primer to this, that should fill in most of the seam. If you have a really deep spot that you don't think the primer will hit, you can try a little bit of modeling putty in there as well. Okay, and I'm just going to wipe that down with a moistened tissue here. I'm using some rubbing alcohol. You can just use plain water as well. The alcohol just evaporates quicker. So here I'm just removing the unattached particles, plastic dust. And this is ready, almost ready for priming. Looks like we have a little bit here. Alright, so I can take this and the rocket itself out for priming and painting. I am not going to show that on this video, but there are lots of good videos on priming and painting out there on the internet. While the rest of the rocket is out being painted, I'm going to assemble the payload section here. And so this other piece that was attached to the nose cone, first we need to remove this little piece of plastic from inside the eyelet here. But you need to be careful not to cut the eyelet itself. And again, be careful that you don't get your fingers in the wrong spot. This is really tight for some reason. There we go. Okay, and so this is where the shock cord and parachute will attach. Now again, up here is a little bit rough from where I cut out the nose cone part, so I'm just going to go ahead and sand that a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and cut that little piece off there. Okay, we got a little sharp spot there as well. Okay. And this part does not have to be completely level at all. I'm just trying to make it look a little better there. Okay. Now, according to the instructions, they are using a friction fit between the tube, the coupler, and the nose cone. And so here it just shows to use some clear tape. And so that would go on here. If you want to put this on permanently, then you would run a bead of plastic model cement around the inside of the tube and then insert this. But that also means you can't take it apart anymore. So it's going to be more versatile if I can take this off, and that gives me access to space down in here as well as the tube itself. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this with some clear tape. So here I have some invisible tape. I'm going to start by doing this about one circumference at a time. Okay, so I'm going to hold this here and I'll wrap this tape just right beyond the edge of the shoulder there. Okay, and that's not quite a, it's only about half a circumference. Try some more. Alright, so that's just a little bit more than one thickness all the way around. Alright, that's still pretty loose, so I'm going to add some more to it. Now, it is possible to paint this if you would like a different color than white. If you're going to do that, though, I don't recommend painting down here on the lower shoulder, as that might interfere with the proper ejection. And if you do paint the upper part here, just be aware that paint, as you put this on and off, that paint's going to get scraped away. Alright, so now, okay, it felt tight going on, but once it's on there, it's still pretty loose. So we will add some more. That's pretty tight there. Maybe you could use one more, maybe half circumference, but that looks pretty good. And then we would do the same thing to the nose cone, adding tape to the shoulder until it goes on firmly. Now keep in mind, if you do something like try and fly an egg in here, that's a lot of mass, and you want to make sure that if it shifts, which you don't want it to do, but if it does, that it doesn't knock the nose cone out. If you're doing egg lofting, you want some kind of padding in here as well. If you're going to use this for an altimeter, then you may want to drill a small hole, about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, somewhere in here. Through the base actually works really well, and that will allow enough air exchange for the altimeter to work properly. My rocket has been painted, and the only things left now are to install the recovery system, the engine retainer, and then apply the decals. So the first thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and cut out the shock cord mount. You can do this with scissors or with a hobby knife. And here, if you don't want to cut up your instructions, just like with the fin marking guide, you make a copy of this. Okay, and this is just another very typical Estes shock cord mount. If you've built any of Estes rockets, they all pretty much use the same thing. So I'm going to run a bead of glue down the length of this. Okay, and then I'm going to put the shock cord on at just a little bit of an angle, so when it folds up it lays beside itself instead of making a big lump. And I'm just going to spread this glue around. Okay, and then we simply fold each number over the next. Pull that down just a little bit. There we go. Okay, so the 1 over the 2, and then the 2 over the 3. Again, I'm trying to get the rubber inside this to lay against itself. It slid a little bit there. That's all right. Okay. And I'm just going to squeeze this to get the glue uniformly spread throughout. And I'm going to add just a little bit more glue here. Get a nice even film. Now before I grab my rocket, I'm going to wipe off my fingers here. Now I'm simply going to put this down as far as I can reach. And I'm going to hold my hand against it on the outside of the rocket and use that to counter the pressure inside. See if I can change this a little bit. See, I'm afraid the rocket's too long for my video camera here, but it's down there, and it simply needs to be down low enough that the shock cord does not interfere with the payload section when the coupler is inserted there. Okay, and then here's my payload section, and you can see I've already done a little bit of decorating there to hide the coupler sections. So this, I will just tie the other end of the shock cord onto the eyelet on the coupler, and just put in a couple of half hitches here. I'm just going to put a little dab of glue on the knot and just work that in a little bit. That'll just help keep things from slipping. And I'm going to cut off all but about 5 millimeters there of the free end so that it does not get caught between the body tube and the coupler itself. I finished painting, and I've done a little bit of custom decoration here using some self-adhesive vinyl. But this brings us to the motor clip, okay, the motor retaining system here. And the first thing I want to do is just make sure that it's going to slip over my engine tube here, and that's really snug. And the instructions suggest roughening up this anyway. And I'm going to do that. So what this is going to do is give a better surface for the epoxy to adhere to. So I'm just using a little medium grit sandpaper here. And then I'm also going to do that right around the motor mount tube here. It doesn't take a lot, but just enough to knock things down, roughen up the surface. And now that should slide on fairly easily, and it does. Okay, now when we go to epoxy this on, we'll want to apply the epoxy to the tube, not to the threaded part of the retainer here, because we don't want any epoxy getting up inside here where it might block the engine. Alright, so here I'm just going to use a little bit of 5-minute epoxy, and we simply mix this up by volume. So equal parts resin and hardener here. There you go. And you're not going to need a whole bunch here, so just a little dab. And then some here. And it doesn't matter if this comes in the double syringe or as individual bottles like mine does here. Either is fine. I'm using a 5-minute epoxy. You could use up to a 30-minute one as well. The only difference is the 30-minute ones are going to tend to run down a lot more. And as long as you keep your rocket inverted, it'll probably flow down into a nice even skin. It's certainly not going to hurt anything. Alright, and just mix this up until it looks uniformly cloudy. I don't suggest getting this on your skin. Some people will develop allergic type reactions to it over time. So if you want to, wear gloves. I'm just going to avoid touching it. Alright, so now I'm just going to kind of scoop this together into a little blob on my applicator. Alright, and I'm going to run this around the outside of my engine mount. You can go ahead and be pretty generous with this. Just don't get it inside the engine mount. But anything excess will just get pushed ahead of the engine ring, and it won't hurt anything. Alright, so now I'm just going to take this, squish it on there, give it just a little bit of a turn to make sure everything's seated well. Okay, and in my case, I didn't see a lot squirt out the edges, so we've got just about the right amount of epoxy. And then once this has set, you can go ahead and just put this on. I wouldn't put it on tightly, but just put that on just so you don't lose the cap. All right, then I'm going to take my parachute here, and you can either just follow the directions and tie the parachute directly to the payload section, or you can do what I do here. So if you've seen any of my other rocketry videos, you know I don't like permanently tying parachutes. Instead, I prefer to put a snap swivel on them. And so here, I'm just going to open up my parachute, and I'm going to move the rocket out of the way here for just a moment. Okay, I can open the parachute up. Okay, this has got a pretty big parachute. And this is actually another reason why I like to use snap swivels, is I can change the parachute depending on what my rocket's doing. So part of the reason that this has such a big parachute is so that when you've got, say, an egg in your payload section, it's going to come down softly. But if you're launching this without a payload in it, this parachute's going to make it drift quite a ways. And if you've got any type of a breeze, you may have to go chasing your rocket for quite some distance. So by having the snap swivel, I can easily change parachutes out, and if I'm not launching an egg and it's kind of windy, I can put a smaller parachute in. So what I'm going to do here is I've gathered all my shroud lines together over my finger, and now I'm just going to let those slide loosely, and I'm going to grab the center of the parachute here and pull those lines taut, and now I'm going to let those slide back and forth over my finger as I adjust where the corners of the parachute are. Okay, and I'm just sliding my fingers over here, adjusting the length of the chute a little bit. And what I want is for all those corners to be approximately in the same position. It doesn't have to be exact, but the closer you get, the less your parachute's going to spin. All right, now that I've got that, I'm keeping tension over here where my loop was. All right, and now I'm going to gather that around my thumb and hold those. The idea here is I don't want to change the length of my parachute shroud loops here, so I'm always keeping tension on one side as I'm transferring this around. And now I take all three of those little tiny loops and I'm going to stick them through the eyelet of the swivel side of my snap swivel. Okay. And these snap swivels you can get at just about any sporting goods store in the fishing section. The size doesn't really matter as far as the weight of the rocket goes, because just about any of these will handle the rocket's weight. Where the size matters is the clip, and we'll see that in just a minute. All right, so now I've just taken that loop, passed the entire swivel through it, and then pulled it down so that now it's going over itself. And as I pull this tight, it makes a nice little knot at the base of that loop. Now I'm going to take a little bit more of my white glue here. Okay, and just a little bit there, and I'm going to work that in. And this is just to keep this loop from slipping and giving us an uneven parachute shroud somewhere. All right, and that just needs to dry for a few minutes. And so now I can take my payload section here, and I'm not going to pack this because the knots are still wet, but when you're ready for this to go, you simply open up the clip, and this is where the swivel size matters. Depends on how big this loop is. All right, now I've still got wet glue here too, so I'm just going to do this quickly for the video and then take it back off again. But this is going to go over the loop here and then close it in. Okay, now depending on how thick that loop is, you may need to get a snap swivel that has a bigger snap on it. But otherwise, the size really doesn't matter. Alright, so I'm going to let this finish drying, but my rocket is done. I hope you had as much fun building this as I did. Have a safe launch, a safe recovery, and you'll see me in the next video.